Blood screamed from his ears as the final seconds of an empire vanished into dust. 2,000 elite knights turned into piles of shredded meat in just 10 minutes. The legendary Roland stands in the center of a stone slaughterhouse, clutching a sword that cannot break, while a ring of faceless killers closes in. One last breath, one desperate choice, and a sound so violent it shatters human skulls. This isn't just a battle, it's the brutal execution of a myth. What he did seconds before his heart stopped is a secret that history tried to bury forever. You are not ready for the truth behind the final stand. The iron gates of Zaragoza slammed shut with a thunderous resonance that echoed like a death knell against the parched Iberian hills. One moment, Count Roland saw the shimmering mirage of victory. The next, he stared at cold, unforgiving stone. The air was thick with the stench of betrayal. Emir Suleiman al-Arabi, the man who had promised the keys to the city in exchange for protection, now stood atop the high battlements, his face a mask of calculated defiance. Below him, the mighty army of Charlemagne, the Frankish king, stood paralyzed in the dust. 1,000s of spears glinted under a brutal sun, but they were useless against these walls. There would be no triumph today, only the bitter taste of a trap closing in. "Withdraw!" The command from Charlemagne ripped through the ranks like a whip. It wasn't a tactical retreat. It was a desperate flight. News had just reached the king's ear that the Saxons were burning the northern borders of his empire, turning his lands into a funeral pyre while he wasted time in this Spanish furnace. The retreat began instantly, a massive serpent of steel and flesh coiling back toward the Pyrenees. But the mountains were not just a barrier. They were a predator waiting for the exhausted. As the vanguard vanished into the shadows of the peaks, Roland remained at the rear. He felt the weight of 1,000 eyes watching from the jagged ridges above. The retreat was fast, frantic, and shadowed by an invisible enemy that moved through the pines like ghosts. The transition from the open plains to the narrow throat of the Roncesvaux Pass was a descent into a green hell. The path narrowed until only 2 horses could walk abreast. To the left, a sheer drop into a misty abyss. To the right, a wall of rock that seemed to lean over them, suffocating the spirit. Roland, leading the rearguard, gripped the hilt of his sword, Durandal. He knew the geography of disaster when he saw it. The main body of the army, led by Charlemagne himself, was already miles ahead, disappearing behind the twisting granite turns. The rearguard was isolated, a silver tail cut off from the head of the dragon. Every clatter of a hoof against a loose stone sounded like a signal to the watchers in the heights. Suddenly, the silence of the forest was shattered by a sound that made Roland's blood turn to ice. It wasn't the clash of steel, but the deep, rhythmic thud of wood hitting wood. High above, the Basques, the fierce masters of these mountains, had been waiting. They didn't use the formal tactics of the Frankish court. They used the earth itself. One massive timber, stripped of its branches, tumbled from a hidden ledge. It struck a rocky outcrop, splintering into deadly shards before crashing into the center of the rearguard. Men and horses were swept into the ravine in a tangle of screams and shattered bone. The path was blocked. The exit was gone. "Form a circle! Shields up!" Roland roared, his voice cutting through the rising panic. But there was no space for a formation. The rearguard was stretched thin, a line of 2,000 men caught in a stone vise. From the ridges a rain of javelins began to fall, launched with terrifying precision. Each projectile carried the weight of a century of mountain vendettas. Roland looked up and saw them. Hundreds of Basque warriors, light on their feet, leaping from crag to crag like mountain goats. They weren't looking for a parley. They were looking for blood. The logic of the battlefield had shifted from conquest to raw survival in the span of 10 heartbeats. A second avalanche of boulders followed the timber, 10 tons of limestone screaming down the slopes. It didn't just kill, it erased. 50 Frankish knights vanished under a mountain of gray rubble in less than 5 seconds. The dust choked the survivors, turning the midday sun into a ghostly orange orb. Through the haze, Roland saw a group of warriors descending the slopes with terrifying speed, knives and short swords gleaming. They were closing the distance, utilizing the chaos to strike at the gaps in the Frankish armor. The rearguard was no longer an elite unit. It was a herd of cattle in a slaughterhouse. Durendal! Roland cried, drawing his legendary blade. The steel caught the dim light, flashing with an unnatural brilliance. Beside him, Oliver, his closest friend and a peer of France, leveled his spear. They stood atop a pile of fallen debris, the only high ground they had. The first wave of attackers hit them with the force of a mountain storm. Roland swung his blade, a silver arc that cleaved through leather and bone. One attacker fell, then two, but for every man he cut down, 5 more seemed to emerge from the trees. This wasn't a battle. It was a frantic scramble against the inevitable. The tension climbed as the realization hit the Franks. Charlemagne could not hear them. The wind in the pass carried the sounds of the massacre away from the main army, blowing north toward the safety of France. They were truly alone. Roland looked back at the narrow gap they had just passed. It was now a wall of dead horses and jagged stone. The rearguard was trapped in a 500-meter stretch of death. Every few minutes a new boulder would crash down, resetting the rhythm of the nightmare. The scale of the disaster was becoming undeniable. "Blow the horn, Roland!" Oliver shouted, parrying a thrust from a Basque chieftain. "Sound the Olifant! The king must turn back!" Roland's jaw tightened. To call for help was to admit defeat, to show the world that the greatest knight of the empire had been broken by mountain tribes. His pride, as sharp as his sword, held his hand back from the ivory horn hanging at his side. He believed they could still fight their way out, that Frankish steel would eventually prevail over mountain cunning. It was a fatal miscalculation. The third wave of attackers brought something new: fire. Bundles of dry brush, soaked in pitch and ignited, were tossed down into the dry vegetation of the pass. The narrow corridor filled with thick, black smoke, blinding the knights and panicking the remaining horses. In the confusion, the sounds of the dying became a constant drone. Roland felt a sharp sting in his side. A javelin had grazed his ribs. He didn't flinch. He couldn't afford to. He was the anchor of this sinking ship. The dynamic of the fight shifted to a desperate push toward a small clearing. Roland led a charge of 20 remaining knights, their armor dented and red with blood. They moved like a single machine, a wedge of steel trying to split the mountain. They reached the clearing, but it was another trap. The Basques had positioned their best archers on the cliffs directly above this spot. As the Franks entered the open space, a volley of arrows hissed through the smoke. 12 men fell instantly, pinned to the earth like insects. Roland stood in the center of the clearing, surrounded by the bodies of his kin. He looked up at the towering peaks of the Pyrenees, which now looked like the teeth of a giant beast. He could see the silhouettes of the enemy moving with predatory grace, preparing for the final descent. The trap of Zaragoza had merely been the bait. The real kill was happening here, in the cold shadows of Roncesvaux. The first part of their journey home had become their final destination. The ground shook as another massive section of the cliffside was prized loose by the attackers. This was the biggest one yet, a slab of rock the size of a cathedral. It slid down the slope with a roar that drowned out the screams of the dying. Roland braced himself, his hand finally reaching for the Olifant, not to call for a rescue he no longer believed in, but to signal the beginning of the end. The dust rose, the sun disappeared, and the true massacre began. The roar of the collapsing mountainside faded, leaving behind a silence more terrifying than the noise, a heavy, suffocating stillness broken only by the crackle of burning brush. Roland stood amidst the settling limestone dust, a ghostly figure in silver mail turned gray by debris. 1,500 survivors of the initial strike scrambled behind him, their eyes wide with the realization that the path back to France was now a wall of impenetrable rock. They were severed. The main army was a distant memory, moving deeper into the northern valleys, oblivious to the slaughter behind them. The trap was no longer just a tactical move. It was a physical cage of stone and fire. "Shield wall! Close the gaps!" Roland's voice thundered, pulling his men from the brink of paralysis. They moved with the frantic energy of the doomed, locking their kite-shaped shields to create a steel roof against the heights. But the Basques were not interested in a static fight. They moved above like shadows, their laughter echoing off the canyon walls, a chilling sound that mocked the heavy, slow-moving nights below. This was a new kind of war, one where the terrain itself was the primary weapon. The dynamics had shifted. The proud cavalry of Charlemagne was reduced to prey in a pit. The first sign of the renewed assault came not from the front, but from the vertical walls. Hundreds of Basque skirmishers, using ropes made of braided leather, began to rappel down the cliffs with dizzying speed. They didn't land in a line. They dropped directly into the center of the Frankish formation. One moment, the shield wall was solid. The next, it was a chaotic swirl of daggers and screams. These mountain warriors moved with a fluidity the armored Franks couldn't match, slipping under sword strokes and hamstringing horses. Roland lunged forward, Durandal singing through the air, his blade a blur of lethal precision that cleared a 3-meter circle around him in seconds. "Oliver, to the left!" Roland shouted as he saw a massive group of attackers rushing a weakened flank. Oliver, his face streaked with blood and soot, led a countercharge. The combat was brutal and intimate. There was no room for the long reach of spears. It was a battle of daggers, pommels, and teeth. Every 3 minutes, a new wave of attackers dropped from the sky, keeping the pressure constant. The Franks were being bled dry, one cut at a time. The point of reconnection for the enemy was the relentless nature of their descent. They were an endless stream of mountain fury. Suddenly, the ground beneath the rearguard began to vibrate again. It wasn't another rock slide, but a coordinated movement from the far end of the pass. A second force of Basques, hidden behind a bend in the trail, emerged in a solid wedge. These were not light skirmishers, but the tribal nobility, armed with heavy axes and stolen Frankish gear. They charged the front of the trapped column with a collective war cry that shook the very air. The scale of the threat doubled in an instant. The rearguard was now being squeezed from 3 sides, the cliffs above, the blockage behind, and the fresh steel in front. Roland saw the danger and knew he had to break the momentum. He spurred his horse, Veillantif, leaping over a pile of corpses to meet the Basque chieftain in mid-charge. The collision was like a lightning bolt. The chieftain's axe shattered Roland's wooden shield, but Durandal was faster. The holy blade sliced through the chieftain's reinforced leather breastplate as if it were parchment. The leader fell, but the momentum of his men didn't break. They flowed around Roland like a river around a stone, focused on the rank-and-file soldiers who lacked the Count's legendary skill. "They are trying to divide us," Oliver yelled, his voice straining. "If the column splits, we are lost." He was right. The Basques were using hit-and-run tactics on a massive scale, pulling small groups of knights away from the main body into the smoke, where they were quickly overwhelmed. Roland realized the enemy's strategy. They weren't trying to win a single grand battle. They were dismantling the rearguard piece by piece. The tension rose as the Frankish line began to fray, the disciplined soldiers starting to look for exits that didn't exist. A new danger emerged from the heights, archers using fire-tipped arrows aimed at the supply wagons. Within 10 minutes, the few remaining carts, filled with grain and dry bandages, were roaring pyres. The smoke became so thick that it turned the narrow pass into a blind labyrinth. Men accidentally struck their own comrades in the haze. The psychological weight of the isolation began to crush the spirit of the 12 peers. They were the greatest warriors of the age, yet they were being picked apart by invisible foes in a godforsaken mountain crack. "Listen," Roland commanded, raising his hand. Through the din of battle, a faint sound drifted from the north, the distant rhythmic beat of Frankish drums. For a heartbeat, hope flared. Could it be the vanguard? Had Charlemagne realized the silence from the rear was too long? The men cheered, a ragged sound of desperation. But the hope was a cruel illusion. The wind had merely shifted, carrying the echo of the main army's march from 10 miles away. It was a reminder of how close safety was, yet how utterly unreachable it had become. The scale of the disaster reached a new peak when a group of Basques managed to seize a high ledge directly over the medical tents. They didn't use arrows. They used massive jars of boiling oil, salvaged from a nearby village. The liquid fire rained down, turning the area into a screaming furnace. The horror of the sight broke the resolve of the younger squires. 20 of them broke formation, trying to climb the sheer cliffs in a fit of madness. They were shot down before they climbed 5 meters, their bodies tumbling back onto the heads of their friends. Roland felt the cold grip of reality. He looked at his men. Fewer than 1,000 now remained. Most were wounded, and all were exhausted. The sun was beginning its descent, casting long skeletal shadows across the pass. The Basques were withdrawing slightly, but not because they were defeated. They were regrouping for a final crushing blow. They knew the Franks were tired, thirsty, and trapped in a graveyard of their own making. "Gather the survivors," Roland whispered to Oliver, his eyes fixed on the darkening ridges. "We move to the high ground by the stream. If we die on our feet, looking the enemy in the eye." As they began the grim march toward a small rocky outcrop, the Basques began a rhythmic drumming on their shields. The sound was like a giant heart beating in the chest of the mountain, counting down the seconds until the final slaughter. The second act was over, and the true nightmare was only beginning. The pause in the drumming was more violent than the noise itself. 1 second of absolute ringing silence was followed by a roar that seemed to tear the sky open. High on the eastern peak, the Basques had spent the last hour levering massive boulders, some the size of houses, onto the edge of a precarious overhang. With a synchronized heave, they let them go. The Avalanche of Fury began as a low rumble and transformed into a tectonic scream. 50 tons of earth and stone accelerated down the 60-degree slope, pulverizing everything in its path. Roland watched, helpless, as a quarter of his remaining force was buried under a surging wave of gray rock. The path didn't just vanish, it was erased from the map. "Move or die!" Roland's voice cracked like a gunshot over the thunder. He grabbed a stunned knight by his gorget and threw him toward the relative safety of a granite overhang. The air was a thick soup of pulverized stone and the copper tang of fresh blood. As the dust began to settle, the scale of the carnage was revealed. The rearguard was no longer a unit. It was a series of isolated islands of men surrounded by a sea of rubble. This was the turning point of the struggle, the moment where the organized defense shattered into 1,000 individual battles for survival. From the swirling dust clouds emerged the first wave of the Basque wolves. These were the elite mountain warriors, stripped to the waist and painted with white clay, wielding heavy iron-bound clubs and long-bladed scramasaxes. They didn't charge in a line. They flowed over the new mounds of debris like a predatory liquid. They targeted the wounded first, finishing them with clinical efficiency. Roland met the first wave head-on. Durandal flashed through the haze, a streak of holy light that severed limbs and shattered shields. He fought with the desperation of a man who knew the clock was ticking down to 0. "They're coming from the stream!" Oliver shouted, his voice barely audible over the clashing steel. The small river that ran through the pass, once a source of thirst-quenching hope, had become a highway for the enemy. Hundreds of attackers were wading through the shallow water, bypassing the rubble piles to strike the Franks from the rear. The pressure was now 360 degrees. Every direction was a front line. Roland realized the Basques were no longer trying to just kill them. They were trying to grind them into the very dust they stood upon. A second point of reconnection happened when the Basque archers shifted their tactics. Instead of high-arcing volleys, they moved down to the lower ledges, firing horizontally into the gaps of the Frankish armor. The scream of the arrows was constant, a jagged melody of death. Roland saw his standard-bearer take 3 arrows to the chest. The golden banner of the 12 Peers began to tilt. Roland lunged through a wall of fire and grabbed the pole before it could hit the dirt. "The banner stays up!" he roared, thrusting the spear end into a Basque warrior's throat. "As long as the gold flies, France stands." The scale of the combat reached a fever pitch as a massive Basque warrior, a man nearly 7 feet tall wielding a stolen Frankish claymore, stepped over the rubble to challenge Roland. The duel was a micro-epic within the chaos. The giant swung with the force of a falling tree, his blade shattering the stone beneath Roland's feet. Roland didn't block. He flowed. He stepped inside the giant's reach, the hilt of Durandal smashing into the man's jaw, followed by a swift, upward thrust that ended the threat. But there was no time for triumph. 3 more warriors took the giant's place instantly. The heat in the pass was becoming unbearable. The burning supply wagons had ignited the ancient pine trees along the slopes, creating a chimney effect. The oxygen was being sucked out of the canyon. Men began to collapse, not from wounds, but from exhaustion and smoke inhalation. Roland felt his lungs burning, his vision blurring at the edges. He looked at Oliver, who was leaning against a rock, his breathing heavy and ragged. "We have to push to the higher ground," Roland wheezed. "If we stay in the smoke, we die like rats." They made a desperate break for a rocky plateau 200 meters ahead. It was a gauntlet of steel. Every step was a struggle against the gravity of the slope and the blades of the enemy. 10 knights fell in that 200-meter dash, their bodies left to the mountain. When they finally reached the plateau, they found it wasn't a sanctuary, but a slaughtering floor. The Basques had already occupied the heights above it, and they were raining down heavy iron jars filled with poisonous vipers and scorpions, a psychological terror that broke the remaining discipline of the squires. The third step of tension occurred when the sun finally dipped below the highest ridge, plunging the pass into a premature, bloody twilight. In the dim light, the Basques seemed to multiply. Their white-painted bodies glowed like vengeful ghosts. They began a rhythmic chanting, a low, guttural sound that vibrated in the chests of the Franks. It was a psychological war as much as a physical one. The Franks, far from their homes and their king, felt the weight of their isolation like a physical burden. They were at the edge of the world, and the world was pushing back. "Roland, look!" Oliver pointed toward the northern exit of the pass. Through the smoke, they could see a final massive blockage. The Basques had used the Avalanche of Fury to create a 10-meter-high wall of stone across the only way out. There was no escape. The realization hit the survivors like a physical blow. The scale of the trap was absolute. They were in a stone box, and the lid was being hammered shut. Roland looked at the ivory horn, the Olifant, hanging at his waist. Its white surface was now stained with the blood of 100 men. He felt the urge to blow it, to scream his defiance to the world, but his pride still held him fast. He wouldn't be the one to tell Charlemagne that his elite guard had been butchered by shadows. "Not yet," he whispered to the wind. "We still have steel. We still have Durandal." The part ended with a final, terrifying sight. From the shadows of the blocked exit, a fresh force of 500 Basque mountain cavalry, mounted on small, hardy ponies, began to trot toward the exhausted Franks. They weren't rushing. They were coming to finish a job that was already 90% complete. The Avalanche of Fury had done its work, and now the scavengers were moving in for the heart. The twilight turned a bruised purple as the Basque cavalry closed the distance, their ponies sure-footed on the treacherous debris. Roland stood at the center of a dwindling circle of 300 men, the remnants of a proud 2,000. The scale of the carnage was now so vast that the stream had turned into a thick, red sludge, choked by the fallen. Every few minutes a fresh point of reconnection occurred as the Basques launched smaller, lightning-fast raids into the Frankish line, dragging men out of the formation like wolves culling a herd. Oliver stood at Roland's shoulder, his shield shattered and his right arm hanging limp, broken by a mace blow. The tension was no longer about victory, it was about the dignity of the end. "Roland, look at them!" Oliver gasped, nodding toward the rows of dead peers. "The flower of France is trampled in the dirt. For the love of God, sound the Olifant. If the king turns now, he might yet save the 12th of us." The logic was undeniable, but Roland's heart was a fortress of stubborn pride. He looked at the ivory horn, then at the blood-stained blade of Durandal. To sound the horn now was to admit that the greatest knight of Christendom had failed his king. "I will not bring such shame upon my kin," Roland replied, his voice a gravelly roar. "We will strike such a blow that the songs of our bravery will drown out the news of our defeat." The step of tension accelerated when the Basque cavalry finally charged. They didn't hit with the heavy impact of Frankish knights. They moved like a whirlwind, throwing javelins and retreating, circling the plateau and whittling down the survivors. First javelin found its mark, piercing Oliver's side. The knight staggered, his face turning the color of ash. Roland caught him, pulling him back from the edge of the slope. In that moment, the pride in Roland's chest finally cracked. He saw his best friend's life leaking through his fingers and realized that his silence was no longer courage. It was a death sentence for everyone he loved. The turning point came when a fresh wave of mountain warriors breached the inner circle, their axes hacking at the very feet of the standard-bearer. The golden banner of Charlemagne finally hit the mud, trampled by the frantic hooves of the Basque ponies. Roland let out a cry of pure, primal agony. He realized that if he died now without a signal, the king would walk into the same trap tomorrow, thinking the way was clear. The choice was no longer about his reputation. It was about the survival of the king and the empire. With a hand trembling from exhaustion and rage, Roland finally grasped the Olifant. "It is too late for us, but not for him," Roland whispered. He raised the ivory horn to his lips. He didn't just blow into it. He poured his entire soul, his remaining life force, and his immense grief into the instrument. The sound that erupted was not a musical note. It was a shattering blast of raw power that echoed off the Pyrenees like a crack of thunder. 20 miles away, the sound reached the ears of Charlemagne's vanguard. The king halted his horse, his face turning pale. "That is the horn of Roland," the king whispered. But his advisors, led by the traitor Ganelon, tried to dismiss it as the wind. Roland blew a second time, even harder. The effort was so immense that the veins in his neck bulged like iron cords. The pressure in his head became unbearable, and suddenly the skin of his temples burst. A thin stream of blood began to flow down his face, staining his golden beard. He didn't stop. The third blast was the longest, a mournful, haunting scream that carried the names of every fallen Frank into the sky. It was a sound of absolute finality. On the distant plains, Charlemagne drew his sword. "That is the sound of a man who is dying," the king roared. "Turn the army to Roncesvaux." The Basques, terrified by the supernatural volume of the horn, momentarily retreated, giving the survivors a few heartbeats of peace. But the silence that followed was even heavier. Roland leaned against a rock, the Olifant falling from his hands, its surface now wet with his own blood. He looked at Oliver, whose eyes were already glazing over. The step of tension had reached its peak. The signal was sent, but the rescue was hours away. They were still trapped in the stone box, and the enemy was recovering from their shock. A Basque chieftain, realizing the horn meant the main army might return, screamed an order in his ancient tongue. The logic of the kill changed. They no longer had time to pick the Franks apart. They had to finish them now. The entire mountain seemed to move as 1,000s of warriors began a final, desperate descent. They came with torches and heavy stones, intent on burying the last of the rearguard before the sun fully set. Roland stood over Oliver. Durendal held low. He was no longer a commander of an army. He was a lone guardian at the gates of hell. "Go to the king, Oliver," Roland muttered to his dying friend, though the man could no longer hear him. "I will hold them here. I will be the wall they cannot break." The dynamic of the scene shifted as the first of the attackers reached the plateau. Roland met them with a fury that seemed possessed. He wasn't just fighting for France, he was fighting for the memory of the men who lay around him. Every swing of Durendal was a testament to the 12 peers. The part ended with Roland standing atop a mound of his own dead brothers in arms, the red sun setting behind him, casting a long, dark shadow toward the approaching horde. The Olifant lay at his feet, its job done. The king was coming, but he would find only a graveyard. The choice had been made, the price was being paid in blood, and the final stand was about to begin. The echoes of the Olifant still vibrated in the thin mountain air as the Basque horde surged forward for the final slaughter. Roland stood alone on the bloody plateau, a titan of iron and grief amidst the ruins of his army. 100s of warriors closed in, their eyes fixed on the legendary Durendal. The hook of this moment was the sheer impossibility of his survival. Roland was a man who had already technically killed himself with the effort of the horn, his temples still weeping crimson, yet he moved with a speed that defied the laws of the flesh. He was no longer a soldier. He was the personification of Frankish defiance. The dynamic of the battle became a frantic, close-quarters nightmare. The Basques, fearful that Charlemagne's heavy cavalry would return at any moment, abandoned all caution. They threw themselves at Roland in waves of 10 and 20. Roland's sword, Durendal, lived up to its legend. The blade didn't just cut, it shattered the heavy iron axes of the mountain men and sliced through their hardened leather shields as if they were mist. Every 2 minutes, a new pile of bodies rose around him, forming a grisly rampart that the enemy had to climb just to reach him. The scale of his solitary resistance began to take on a supernatural quality. A point of reconnection occurred when a group of 5 Basque chieftains, recognizing that Roland was the only thing standing between them and total victory, formed a circle around him. They attacked in perfect synchronization, their spears lunging from all sides. Roland parried a thrust meant for his throat, spun to disarm a second attacker, and used the weight of his mail-clad body to crush a third against the jagged rocks. Even as his armor was punctured and his blood mixed with the dust of the pass, he did not give an inch. He was the anchor of an empire that refused to sink. The tension escalated as the sun vanished completely, leaving the pass illuminated only by the flickering orange glow of the burning forest. In this hellish light, Roland saw his last surviving comrade, the Archbishop Turpin, crawling toward him. The holy man, despite having 4 spears in his body, raised his hands to bless the fallen. "The gates of paradise are open for you, sons of France," Turpin cried, before a final arrow silenced him. Roland let out a roar of such pure, crystalline rage that the nearest attackers recoiled in primal fear. He was now truly the last of the 12 peers. The steps of tension reached a peak when the Basques, frustrated by their inability to kill the lone knight, brought up their final weapon, heavy sling stones. From 20 meters away, they began a relentless bombardment. One stone shattered Roland's left shoulder. Another cracked his helmet, sending a fresh veil of blood over his eyes. He stumbled, his knees hitting the red-soaked earth. The Basques cheered, thinking the lion had finally fallen. But as they rushed in to claim his head, Roland drove Durendal into the ground to pull himself back up. He stood, swaying but unbroken, a specter of war that refused to die. The logic of the fight moved toward its inevitable conclusion. Roland felt his strength draining into the soil. His heart, strained by the horn and the wounds, was failing. He looked toward the north, toward France, and for a fleeting second he saw the glint of distant fires, the torches of Charlemagne's army returning. They were too far to save his life, but they were close enough to witness his legend. Roland turned his gaze back to the Basque horde, which was now hesitant, spooked by the sight of a man who seemed to be powered by something beyond human endurance. "I am Roland," he screamed into the darkening canyon, "Count of the March of Brittany. I do not fall to the likes of you." He launched a final desperate charge, not to escape, but to drive the enemy back from the bodies of his friends. He cut a path 30 meters deep into the Basque ranks, his blade moving with the rhythm of a harvester. The enemy broke and fled back toward the higher ledges, terrified by the iron ghost that continued to strike long after a normal man would have been cold. The final reconnection of the part happened when Roland felt the cold touch of the end. He retreated to a marble-white rock that stood near the edge of the plateau. He was alone now. The Basques watched from the shadows, waiting for the life to finally leave him. Roland looked at Durendal, the sword that contained the holy relics of the saints. He couldn't let it be captured. He couldn't let such a weapon be used by those who had butchered his brothers. With the last of his fading strength, he prepared to destroy the finest blade ever forged. The part ended with Roland raising Durendal high above his head, the blade glowing with a faint, internal light against the black mountain sky. He brought it down with a thunderous strike against the marble rock, intending to shatter the steel. But as the sparks flew and the sound echoed like a bell through the entire range of the Pyrenees, the sword remained whole. Not even a notch appeared on its edge. The stone, however, split in two. Roland looked at the unbreakable blade and realized that his legacy, like his sword, was now etched into the very bones of the earth. The steel of Durendal rang against the marble with a sound that transcended the physical world, a celestial chime that signaled the end of an era. Roland stared at the unblemished blade, his breath coming in ragged, bloody gasps. The sword was invincible, a holy relic that refused to be unmade. Realizing he could not destroy it, Roland's final act of defiance was one of profound symbolism. He would not leave his weapon to be looted like a common trophy. With his one remaining arm, he thrust the blade deep into a narrow crevice of the split rock, wedging it so firmly that only a king or a saint could ever hope to retrieve it. He had protected the honor of France until his last heartbeat. The hook of the final moments was the eerie transformation of the battlefield. The Basque warriors, seeing Roland slump against the white stone, did not rush forward to finish him. They stood back in a wide, silent circle, paralyzed by a superstitious dread. To them, this was no longer a man. He was a monument of stone and blood. Roland felt the chill of the mountain night seeping into his marrow, but his mind was clear. He turned his body with agonizing slowness, dragging his legs until he faced south, toward Spain, toward the enemy, toward the city of Zaragoza that had started this tragedy. He would die as a conqueror, looking at the land he had challenged, never showing his back to the foe. The dynamic of the scene shifted as the first distant notes of Charlemagne's trumpets finally breached the pass. It was a 1,000-fold echo of the Olifant, a thunderous response from the king's 3,000 knights. The Basques heard it and knew their window of opportunity had vanished. They melted back into the shadows of the peaks, disappearing into the mist like the ghosts they had imitated all day. They left behind a valley of silence, a cathedral of the dead. Roland heard the trumpets and smiled, a crimson stain spreading across his teeth. His king was here. The signal had been received. His mission was complete. The step of tension reached its absolute peak as Roland felt his soul straining to depart. He didn't simply expire. He staged his death as a final prayer. He placed his ivory horn, the Olifant, beneath him and laid his sword arm over the rock. He reached into his glove and pulled out his right-hand gauntlet, offering it up to the darkened sky, a vassal's final gesture to his true overlord. Legend says that at that moment, the clouds parted, and a single beam of moonlight fell upon the plateau, illuminating the hero in a shroud of silver. The transition from life to myth happened in the space of a single, quiet breath. The culmination arrived with the roar of hooves. Charlemagne burst into the clearing at the head of his elite cavalry, his white beard flowing like a banner of grief. He didn't find a battle. He found a masterpiece of carnage. The king dismounted, his iron boots clattering on the stones, and ran toward the white rock. He saw Roland, appearing as if he were merely sleeping, his face turned toward the land of the Saracens. The king fell to his knees, letting out a cry of lamentation that would be retold in poems for 1,000 years. "The right arm of my empire is broken," he wailed, cradling the cold head of his favorite nephew. The finality of the story was swift and jarring. Charlemagne did not stay to mourn in silence. He ordered a 3-day pursuit of the enemy, but the mountains offered no more victims. The Basques were gone, reclaimed by the crags. The king returned to the pass to gather the bodies of the 12 peers. Roland was carried back to France on a litter of shields, his name already transforming from a man into a symbol of ultimate loyalty. The pass of Roncesvaux would forever be haunted by the sound of a phantom horn, a reminder that the greatest victories are sometimes found in the most crushing defeats. Roland's story ended not with a burial, but with an echo. As the Frankish army marched north, leaving the Pyrenees behind, the sun rose over the peaks, glinting off the hilt of a sword stuck in a stone and an ivory horn resting on a blood-stained plateau. The man was dead, but the song of Roland had just begun to play. The final image was of the empty, silent pass, where the wind through the pines sounded exactly like a dying man's breath through a horn. The legend was sealed in stone, 35,000 characters of blood and glory written into the history of the world.